it may not really be their true emotional opinion, which is okay, because the job is not to simply get in office and do whatever you'd like. Whatever the spirit moves you is a very poor way to govern. All right, so today we are back and we're going to talk about the way we see ourselves and how we interact in society, and specifically how private or how public we are with our opinions. And we constantly have to go through this monitoring process as people just interacting with others, how much of our true feelings to reveal and to whom.
Yeah, so like the whole idea here is that when it comes to politicians, we assume that they're putting on an act, right? There's insincerity, lack of authenticity, and that we think of this as being a distinctively politician way of moving about in the world. But what we want to highlight is this is something that's universal to just being a human being, and that we all have to show different sides of ourselves depending on the crowd we're around, whether we're with our friends or their family, with our professional colleagues. And one of the issues I think that politicians in general seem to run into is that they have to kind of chart this really fine line, this delicate balance between showing their private beliefs about something, but also wanting to be a good representative for their constituents. And so what we're seeing in this public face, as it were, is the attempt to maximize their support and voter turnout, donations, by showing just how much fealty they have to the values of that political party. But we look at that as sort of like a model to follow even in our own interactions as private citizens and voters. Yeah. But we have to understand that that's just basically one version of that individual with a specific objective in mind, where we have a different objective as voters when we're talking to each other about relevant issues and policies.
It makes the whole thing extremely confusing because in some ways we want politicians to be authentic. We want them to express, speaking from the heart. And it really resonates when they say something that we think is their true opinion. But we're never sure it's their true opinion because often they have to say certain things and pledge certain allegiances just simply to survive in the political party system. That's just the way the thing goes. So as often they will say nothing as well. Like they'll kind of fill airtime, like saying things, but it doesn't read as authentic. It's kind of like it feels like they're going through the motions, having to pay homage to the party dogma at times. And so oftentimes the most successful politicians do speak from the heart, and those often are the moments that really capture our attention. But it always is a bit of an act because we never quite know what's their real opinion versus one that's being manufactured for the moment. Same thing happens to us in regular old conversations. How often do you have to kind of like have this little bit of a monitoring process in your own head of how much should I reveal about my own true opinion, especially when it comes to politics, because you're walking out on a ledge, right? If you don't meet with a receptive audience, it can be quite punishing socially. So we have to think about it.
Yeah, it's true. And I think that we also have to consider what exactly is the act for and who is it for, right? We understand with politicians, it's very obvious what's going on there. They've got cameras on them. Everyone's watching, so to speak, or at least potentially. A single slip-up can be a viral moment that can absolutely eviscerate that politician's whole career. And I'm sure they're vigilant and aware of this. So when we hear these sort of non-answers that politicians can give, it's really not an attempt to say anything. It's an attempt to not say something that can do damage to themselves in those cases. But in our cases as voters, when we think about how we're going to communicate with each other, we're not really performing, even though you can tell. I think we can all tell when we're talking to somebody who's kind of borrowing not just the position or the thought process around an issue, but even the style of communication. And going beyond politicians, I think we can comment on even when it comes to that public face, private face divide, even when it comes to media commentators, right? Media figures, I think, have the exact same divide in place. They understand they have an audience, that they have to, because there's audience capture, this whole idea that if a commentator has carved out a certain demographic with a certain point of view, they want to maximize their appeal to that group, the same way a politician does. So it's very difficult, I think, to remain quote unquote completely sincere in our political dealings, political conversation. And if anything, we're the ones in the privileged position. We don't have all these eyes and cameras on us all the time. And so we actually have the liberty and the freedom to be more explorative when it comes to a range of points of view on even controversial topics.
Yes, and there's a cultural aspect to this. So one thing that we found helpful is you had mentioned the public face versus the private face a moment ago. In Japan, they have terms for this. The private face, one's true, authentic opinions, is known as the hone. And that is not expressed a great deal in Japanese culture. What's more commonly expressed is the tatame, or the public face. And that would be things that are not really authentically how you feel emotionally about the situation, but they're rather things that are culturally moderated, culturally appropriate. A custom could be in the tatame realm. And that's often the case with any sort of professional role, including a politician's role. They have to sort of say what's right for the moment. And then, I think there's just a great deal of value in thinking about those two terms. What is your private face opinion? What is your public face framing of that opinion? And sometimes they could be the same opinion. It's just that you're not going to really put it all out there with everybody. So this is an important aspect of our culture. We tend to value the private face more, and we think it's inauthentic if you're not saying what you really think. There's a wider acceptance of sort of off-the-cuff remarks, straight from the heart remarks. I'm just looking at social media and YouTube particularly. Many people are just winging it, saying extreme emotional things, and they do get a lot of traction that way. And I think the democratization of information has kind of revealed that there is an appetite for authentic private face opinion. However, in professional realms, there's still a necessity of wearing the public face. It's doubly so for politicians. They constantly have to battle with private face, public face. What are they telling their donors? What are they telling their friends? What are they saying in front of a camera? It can be very different messaging depending on the audience.
It's true. I think even speaking more to this tatame, this public face idea, is you can tell there's a certain script involved, right? As neuroscientists, cognitive psychologists, we speak about the difference between fluid and crystallized intelligence, right? And I think with the tatame, it's more crystallized, right? There's a script that's already been laid down, and you could tell just the fluency and eloquence with which a politician or a media figure will speak on an issue. As the audience, we think, well, look at this very careful, thoughtful individual engaging in this topic. But unbeknownst to us, this is a script that's been well laid down, well hewn over the course of many dozens of conversations until they don't have to think about it anymore. But I think what goes with the hone, the private face, is something much more unguarded, much more vulnerable, much more willing to even make a faux pas or two in trying to reason through a topic. A reasoning isn't clean and pretty looking, right? When I think of reasoning, I think of something that's kind of clunky, kind of klutzy, and willing to take chances, take risks, right? And I think that you can tell, like even when we are engaging in a sort of metacognitive analysis, and we're thinking about our own thinking and being very self-aware, we can tell when we're engaging in that type of process because we're not really quite sure where to go. It's almost like we're having to carve a path right there in real time as we're thinking about an issue. And it can be very laborious and very stressful and anxiety-provoking because we don't feel like we're our most polished selves. But that's where a lot of growth can actually happen.
And when someone gets into that script, like you almost feel like they're reading a script, you don't even have to listen to it. It's kind of just kind of going on, and there's nothing really being said of substance, right? And something about what we think of as the private face is really connected to our true emotions. So I do feel as if we have an intuition about whether someone's speaking from the heart or whether they're faking it, right? And if we sense they're faking it, there's a big social penalty there. So one thing that has been helpful when we've had this conversation about public face, private face, is we can think about politicians on a debate stage or especially in front of the media. They're often having to mix some level of public face and private face. No politician ever just says exactly what they think all the time. They just would that can be sort of novel and interesting, but it tends not to be a successful strategy because you simply have to play team sports when it comes to politics. And if you're a loner, you're shooting off wild opinion all the time, that tends to wear thin after a while. And so I think we're seeing more of that style lately on the political scene. There's more of a tolerance and even an encouragement of that sort of provocative style, whereas maybe in prior decades, it was all public face with a lot of moderated opinions. Many politicians of today do follow the public face. They always put on the team first public face. They may not get as much news coverage because provocativeness does sell in terms of, it's interesting. But many people will wear the public face. It's done in corporate, settings as well. You have to simply make it a company first kind of approach. And so some mixture of this has to happen all the time. And I think when we take in a political, debate with like real politicians talking, it's helpful to try to categorize, are they saying something because they need to for public reasons, for party reasons, or is this when they're going off the cuff and kind of being more authentic? I think we all have, you spoke of metacognition, I think we have a sense for whether the level of authentic opinion we're seeing. Almost everyone is going to mix in some level of public face, at least to moderate their private face opinions. But if you speak entirely from the heart, that becomes problematic as a messaging tactic. And if you speak all from script, that just becomes boring.
It's true. There's definitely a balancing act. And it's still on this tatame idea I find really interesting. Observing it's much more crystallized is it's kind of static in some ways. I think there's almost a freeze frame that occurs when a politician or a media figure, or even for ourselves, if we choose to engage in political dialogue like this, where we feel compelled to be pigeonholed, right? Almost like we have to be engaged in, we're almost in arrested development. Once we staked out a position, we give the impression that we're a flip-flopper. In fact, speaking of metacognition, one of the world's experts on this topic, Steve Fleming, from University College London, who's done a lot of very interesting neuroscience, brain science, mapping out the areas of the brain that are involved in self-awareness, thinking about our own minds. What he observed, actually there's a chapter in his book, Know Thyself, that touches on this I found really interesting, is that there's a penalty that politicians pay for changing their mind. And so this tone, having the more fluid element, allowing one to be dynamic and changing one's minds with new data, new information coming in, the way a scientist should engage in the world, that they're seen as being less trustworthy, right? In fact, one of the examples he gives is of John Kerry, the former presidential candidate. He was talking about some bill he had voted for, and he was being criticized for changing his opinion on it. And he said, well, before I voted for that bill, I was against it at first. Like that was his defense. And it occurred to me that that's very unfortunate, that we don't give each other that room, that leeway to grow as individuals. It would be strange if you think about it, when it comes to any other domain of life, if we didn't change our minds. In some ways, like when it comes to our choice of restaurant to go to, or the films we enjoy, there's always this dynamic element, always changing and evolving. But when it comes to politics, there's this much more static, ossified element that lends itself to the tatame, the public face. And I think when we engage in our own private lives as voters, as citizens, we should give ourselves that leeway, that room to be less static, not seen as a flip-flopper, but instead being like a scientist, being like someone who takes in the data, allows their beliefs to be changed by incoming information.
That's right. And it's really depending upon the setting that you can give a little bit more of an off-the-cuff comment. But you're absolutely right. If you don't seem predictable in your ability to carry the torch for your party, your political career is not going to go very far for most people. And that just is part of the landscape. And I think one of the challenges that we have in the United States now is politicians become either loved or hated depending on how well they appear to profess the party dogma opinion, the prevailing opinion. And if you're not careful, you can start to think that they're always sharing their private face opinion and that you hate them, right? Because anything that you don't agree with, they seem to be the champion of that idea. But what can be helpful is to remember that they have to say certain things. It may not really be their true emotional opinion, which is okay, because the job is not to simply get in office and do whatever you'd like. Whatever the spirit moves you is a very poor way to govern, right? We need our governance to be predictable in some ways, and in the two-party system, you just have to play team ball. That is just what we should expect. And so when particularly somebody from the other party that you prefer less expresses some opinion that you disagree with strongly, you probably should. It's helpful to step back and say, well, maybe they don't really think that clearly about it in their real, in the privacy of their own mind, right? And you could say, well, maybe they're a hypocrite if that's the case, but we all have to come to grips with the fact that we live in a society, and politicians particularly. You have to always hold in mind what's best for you, or what you like the most may not always be what's best for the rest of the country or for the particular moment. And so that's, again, the science behind this is often called theory of mind, which is this idea that we consider other beings to have a mind and a consciousness, and we have to try to read that all the time. We're never perfect at reading it, but we're decent at it, and that's why eye contact matters so much, and bonding with somebody matters quite a bit. And it's just, again, this negotiation that we have to make all the time, and politicians must make. Do I say what's right for the party? I probably should, or do I give my authentic opinion? Maybe I should in certain instances. And there are always moments where an authentic opinion, the hone, just kills them, or it's one of those shining moments of like, they really bond with an audience. And so they're stepping out on a limb, they're going out on a ledge, so to speak, when they do express the hone or their private face opinion. And so we probably should cut them a break in some ways and maybe admire that when they do express a real opinion, even if we don't necessarily agree with it. They're being more authentic in the moment sometimes.
In fact, I think one thing that this is basically, behind the scenes conversations that Dan and I have, what we want to do with our podcast, to make it more about the ideas, the concepts, and less about the specific personalities, right? So without necessarily mentioning names, we can think of politicians, part of their brand, part of their appeal is this whole idea of authenticity, right? Showing what's transparently going on in their minds in real time. And even though we don't really agree with their opinions, at least I've seen some commentaries that journalists will notice that, or political scientists will notice that even if we don't agree with the opinions of a certain brand of especially populist politicians, we still admire just the courage it takes, at least to be authentic, at least to say, okay, I'm willing to even make blunders in my attempt to try to be as transparent as possible about one's thought process. But there's kind of like a Darwinian element to this too, because most attempts to engage in the hone, to be authentic, to take that chance, are heavily punished, especially if they fall outside that Overton window that the range of opinions we're allowed to have or are part of the team brand. And there's only just that rarefied few instances where one has just struck the right chord, and it even seems to change what counts as the tatame, right?
Yeah,
and I think because it happens so infrequently, that's why there's a general reluctance to go out on a limb like this and try to walk that tightrope of thinking in real time, really reasoning out loud when it comes to very complex issues.
Yeah, there's a cultural element to this too. So we mentioned Japanese culture has a difference here. There's a reason they have terms for public face and private face. Everyone has a public face true opinion, a public face general opinion, and they have sort of their true hone opinion, but we don't often speak in those terms. I think it's very helpful to keep those terms in mind as Americans, because we are not at war right now. It tends to be in wartime, the public face is maintained much more strongly. That's not a time for off-the-cuff opinions that dissent, right? When you need to get something done and it's dire, people lock in on the public face opinion. I think you see some of this more with British culture, especially post World War II. Having gone through that, there was a real high priority on the public face opinion. Like, we're in this together. And so in the US now, I think we do have the luxury of being able to express private face opinions a lot. But we do have to keep in mind that we all can win with a public face element to this as well. So we should really be in the business of mixing these two appropriately. And it's up to you. We can't tell you how to do this. It's just, when there's a moment to give your true opinion and that it's going to be well received. And there's moments where you just hold it back and say something a little bit more moderate or politically correct, for lack of a better phrase.
Yeah, I think that's some good practical advice for all of us to keep in mind when it comes to this divide of public face and private face, tadame and hone, and how we recognize it even in our own lives as we try to grow as individuals. Try to use politics as a wellspring for growth for ourselves, growing and developing as individuals, as opposed to it tearing ourselves down, tearing our social fabric apart. And I think that being mindful of a concept like this, of a divide like this, is all in the spirit of ensuring that that's the case.
So our advice is, when you hear a politician give any sort of speech, whether it's you're for that party or against that party, or like that individual or hate that individual, just keep in mind that's not their true opinion, that they're just, there's depth to it. There may be reasons they're saying certain things and not saying other things. And so it's up to us as consumers of those ideas to judge, what are they saying really? And how well are they going to do at team building? Because that's also something our country needs. Now, as citizens, we have even more leeway, because we can be more dynamic and flexible, since we're not playing for a team. We don't have to enforce that public face opinion all the time with our fellow citizens, and we shouldn't strive to do that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that as we consider follow-up topics to this, when it comes to our media diet, I think that makes a major impact on the face that we show the public. Because we don't just consume information in the sense of, hey, what do we think about this issue? But even when it comes to the style with which we communicate and express ourselves. And so it's sort of this idea of it's not just a passive act of consuming content. Just like whatever we consume nutritionally ends up becoming a part of ourselves, literally becomes a part of our bodies. I think the hygiene of our ability to express ourselves in a well-considered way, with conscientiousness, with respect, a lot of this has to do with the sources that we're drawing from. I think that's something that's sort of inescapable. But I think one thing that we find challenging as voters, as citizens, is finding those rarefied sources. Just like when you notice you're going to grocery shopping, and there's plenty of highly refined junk food to go around to tempt us. But when it comes to the nutritious things, maybe they're kind of buried away a little more obscurely. We have to use discernment to know how to conduct ourselves in a way to where we can show the best versions of ourselves that make it easier to bridge build instead of bridge burn, so to speak, right?
Right, and if you're listening to one party exclusively and their main news sources, you run the risk of failing to realize there's nuance, right? That there's another public opinion version and private opinion versions that are out there. So diversifying one's media diet helps with this sort of reading of the landscape and what people are really saying. So look forward to that conversation in the near future.
Absolutely.